In some of the earlier videos in this series, I've talked to you about insufficient explanations given historically to explain why the early Christian church came up with the idea that Jesus had risen from the dead. Some of those ideas, you can find them in earlier videos. One would be that Jesus was just gravely injured. He didn't really die. He escaped from his tomb, was found by his followers, and the idea that he rose from the death is sort of a legend that comes later. That doesn't work out. You can look at our earlier videos to see why. Did Jesus' body actually go to a tomb, or was he simply sort of thrown in an unknown area, a dump, which is usually where convicted criminals would have been thrown? Again, looked already at why that doesn't really hold up, this supposition. And another one would be that the disciples stole his body, that indeed he did die and that he was placed in a particular known tomb, but that the disciples stole the body. Another video covers why that's not really a tenable objection. Beyond those objections, let's start looking at the claims that are made in the Bible. Multiple eyewitnesses claimed to have seen Jesus, a risen Jesus, not a wounded, dragging himself along Jesus with blood gushing out of a wound in his side, but instead a Jesus who was fully alive, able to converse and to walk miles with them and to eat and drink in the picture of health. Interestingly, the very first people whom Jesus encounters are a group of women. This was interesting in the ancient world, especially in an ancient first century Jewish context, because women were not often trusted to be able to give testimony regarding such important matters in places like the court. If you had a woman, her testimony counted literally for less than a man's. You had to have the testimony of multiple women in order to counteract the testimony of a man in court. If a man said, "This happened," and a woman said, No, this happened," even if evidence seemed to lean on her side, you needed yet another woman, or preferably another man, to counteract the first man's testimony. Jesus picks women as the first people that he appears to after rising from the dead. Sometimes this is known as the criterion of embarrassment in talking about Christian apologetics. It would have been embarrassing for the early church to have said, "So who is your source? Who's telling you that Jesus has risen?" Well, it was some women. That would have been, in the ancient world, an embarrassing thing. They would not have been seen as trustworthy as men would have been, or as reliable. Obviously, looking from our modern vantage point, we see a lot of problems with that. We have to understand, we're looking at a different culture. If they wanted to make up a lie, in other words, they would have made up a different lie. We have no problem with it being, in our modern culture, women who go to the tomb first, and rightly so. There's no reason to have a problem with this. Ancients would have had a problem with the way that the story is here recounted. The criterion of embarrassment, the idea that it would have been embarrassing and harder to defend the story that the Bible presents to us in the ancient world when the Bible was written, is a mark as to why we should give this story credence and the claims that they make. Now, the women are not the only ones who make the claim that they encounter the risen Jesus. Various of Jesus' male followers as well, the 12 disciples, encounter him. They don't all encounter him at the same time, interestingly. One of them, a man named Thomas, is absent from the group's supposed first encounter with the risen Jesus, and he doubts. He won't believe it. Of course, it's an unbelievable thing. Not until Jesus appears another week later to the group when Thomas is there with them will Thomas believe. Others were not ever claimed to have been eyewitnesses in the 40 days after Jesus' resurrection, during which he appeared, according to the Bible, to his various followers. We could focus on someone like the Apostle Paul, a man who was first known as Saul. Although he claimed to have had an experience with the risen Jesus, he was not one of the ones who saw Jesus in those weeks after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Why does Saul become a Christian? Why does Paul become this preacher of the resurrection of Jesus Christ? That's a topic for another video. See you next time.